Hello and welcome to this episode of The Broadcast. I'm your host, David Brooks, and I'm delighted to be joined this week by Becky Wood, who is Client Director and Head of the Debts Endgame Solutions team based in Manchester. So welcome, Becky. Good to have you. And joining us is Steve Hull, who is partner in the Burgess Salmon Pensions team based down in London. So we've got a real north-south divide joining us today. So welcome to you both. And we're going to talk today about surpluses. And it's quite a big topic. We're going at it from the perspective of advisors and trustees trying to work out what to do with the surplus when it's arisen. We originally started planning this before the pensions bill was a bill, but now it's an act. We're wondering if this has changed the world we're living in. So luckily, we've got Steve here to tell us basically what's been happening with the legislative background of what trustees and employers can do with a surplus that has emerged in their scheme.
Okay, well, look, thanks very much indeed, David. So just before I get into the legislative position, I just want to start off with, where this pension scheme came from in the first place, just to sort of set the context for any sort of further discussion which we might have with regard to distribution of surplus. Now, the pension scheme wouldn't have existed were it not for the employer. So the employer has created the pension plan as part of its remuneration structure and has provided the employees with a promise. And ultimately, that promise is set out within the benefit structure of the trust documentation. And that is kind of where it ends for the employee. They are entitled to that promise, whether there's any funding there or not, as the case may be. The pension scheme is a very sensible place to place that funding. And the employer then appoints trustees to make sure that those assets are no longer part of the employer's asset base, can't be claimed by an insolvency practitioner on insolvency, and also to gain very advantageous tax provisions that would apply to tax advantages that would apply to the scheme. And appoints the trustees to operate that pension plan in accordance with the terms of a trust, which the employer bestows upon those trustees. So that's the birth of the plan. It's the employer's scheme, the employer's trust. He or she appoints the trustees. Off you go, and that's it. So since then, we've had legislation which has overridden some parts of the trust documentation. So initially, history, you would refer to, in terms of access to the surplus, you'd refer to the trust documentation. Then we have legislation which has imposed restrictions on access to surplus on an ongoing basis, which hitherto has been extremely restrictive. Basically, the trustees need to decide it's in the interest of the members to pay the surplus out. The surplus isn't a surplus unless the scheme is funded on a buyout basis as a minimum, and it's only the amount in excess of the buyout that's regarded as the surplus. And the trustees effectively control that. Irrespective of what the rules say, the trustees effectively control that, which pretty much means that it's impossible to create or imagine a situation where it's going to be in the members' interest for a surplus to be paid out of the scheme. And indeed, because of the paucity of surpluses pre-2022, it wasn't really an issue which arose very often. We have now built up, and it's scale that's sort of driving this, as well as the overriding interest in investing in UK PLC. We now have the Pension Schemes Act, which now changes that ongoing circumstance, that ongoing situation. And it will allow, currently, the legislation is only enabling, and effectively it allows the trustees by resolution to remove or relax any restriction imposed by the scheme on the exercise of the power. So we are now genuinely in a new world where there is going to be legislative encouragement to allow access and enabling to allow access to surplus monies. A lot of the old provisions will be repealed. So the old resolution under Section 251, for example, whereby a resolution had to be passed by 2016 to preserve an existing power to pay surplus money to the employer, that's gone. The requirement for it to be in the members' interests, it is anticipated that that will go. And we don't know whether it's going to be retained in regulations, but ultimately that's intended to go. So there will then also be guidance issued by the regulator with regard to perhaps guidance for trustees in terms of the process that they need to go through and the things that they need to consider before they decide to relax the power and indeed then to utilise that power. Highly likely that it's also going to be subject to the consent of the employer. David, that's pretty much it.
That's great. Now, I think so. We don't know where we are, effectively, but the question is, and this is the big question, and I feel like Stevie will be giving us a bit of a spoiler, but whose whose surplus is it? And Becky, I'm going to bring you in because you've been waiting patiently. But who, when we're thinking about whose surplus is it, it's how do we go around managing those competing interests? You've got, trustees will have their views, members will have their views, employer will have their views, and then we also have the surrounding industry discussion, around people's different opinions of how these surpluses have arisen and who they should be shared with. So, how do we get through that?
Okay. Thanks, David. So I think the question as to whose surplus, it sounds really simple, but in practice we know it's not. There isn't a single answer that works across all schemes, and it's less about trying to pin down the ownership in a strict sense and more about, I think, from a trustee perspective, making sure we've worked through all of the relevant factors and then we can stand behind whatever decision it is that we reach. Whatever we decide, so whether the scheme's ongoing or on a wind up, members are going to be really interested. It's a surplus. We'll all have seen situations where trustees, members have not necessarily been happy with the decisions that have been reached. And I think as this is becoming more and more in the press, people are seeing about it, those decisions are going to come under more scrutiny. So it's not about us being technically right. It's been about us being able to show that what we've done is fair, that we can explain it, and it's robust from a member's perspective. So there's two different situations. The first one is where a surplus has been built up. So for example, at buyout or wind up, and in that case, you know what the surplus is. The members' benefits have been secured. You're not looking forward in the same way, covenant or future risk as you would if the scheme's ongoing and you've made that decision to run on. So it becomes more about the distribution decision, but that doesn't mean that it's really, really simple. So the first thing that we have to look at is the powers. Steve's touched on that a little bit. So we need to think about where the power actually sits. So in many schemes, what I've seen in practice, that the trustee doesn't tend to have a unilateral power. Steve might say that I'm wrong there, and he's seen different. And you don't just think about the surplus rule in isolation either. So we need to look at other rules which give the trustees powers possibly as well, such as on wind up, and then that will shape how decisions then play out. In reality, in an ideal world, we want to get to a joint position with the sponsor. That's not necessarily easy. It can be really quite challenging. You've got different perspectives, sometimes really competing views. There's a number of key considerations that we need to think about, but I think it's really important to start with recognising the employer's interests. Steve did a great job of setting out, the starting point of pension schemes and why they were set up. And the employer's interest is really a legitimate factor in this decision. And I think for some trustees that can feel at odds with their duties toward members and trustees, that they should take into account the employer's position. But we do need to think about the fact, again, as Steve talked about, the employer has contributed the majority of funding over time generally to a scheme. We've got schemes where they were possibly even non-contributory as well for members. They've taken the downside risk, they've supported the scheme through difficult periods. So it's really important that we take account of the employer's interest. Other factors to think about: the origin of the surplus. So in cases where I'm involved, where there's a surplus, we do an analysis to see where the surplus has come from. So how much has a member contributed, how much has sponsor contributed? And as I said a minute ago, you tend to find that the employer has contributed significantly more than the members over that time. And we all remember the times of large deficits, and the sponsors were having to fund those. So I think sometimes when we're talking about a surplus, it's at least in part caused by overfunding from an employer. But I think those 2 points really help then frame the discussions that you have as to whose surplus it is. And then there's the other one, so importantly, member expectations. Some members might have an expectation that a surplus might come back to them, and then there's the other factors that I've let Steve touch on more, such as considering the purpose of the scheme. So that's it in a nutshell for a scheme where the scheme's winding up and buying out. But I'll stop there before I talk about when we're thinking about a scheme that's ongoing and running on.
Yeah, Steve, did you want to come in on any of those?
Brilliant. I mean, it's a brilliant summary from Becky, and all of the above is absolutely applicable as far as the trustees are concerned. I mean, ultimately, I always encourage both parties, employer and trustee, to sort of go back to, where did the pension scheme come from? How has it all arisen? And then in determining the surplus and whose surplus is it, it ultimately is, you look at the trustee rules, that's where you've got to go first. Then you've got to apply the legislation, and that's the framework within which you've got to operate. And in terms of the ultimate decision, as far as the employer and the trustees are concerned, but particularly the trustees, it is absolutely, as Becky was saying, it is one of process. It is the process that you go through that is going to determine the outcome, and it is the process that you go through that's going to provide the protection as far as the trustees are concerned. And it is that sort of age-old analysis which we've all heard so often, which is, consider all relevant factors, discard all irrelevant factors, take advice on aspects on which you're not an expert, understand, question that advice. And then consider it as a board of trustees, or as an individual trustee. If you're sole corporate, consider it with your colleagues, and then arrive at a conclusion, take into account the employer's views as well. And I think once you've gone through all of that process, by natural process, you will arrive at a conclusion that is, by virtue of the process, defendable. And ultimately, an external person who hasn't been through that person might, typically a member will say, well, I don't agree with that. And if they do, well, okay, they've got an opportunity to take it to the Ombudsman, and the Ombudsman will analyse the process, not the outcome. The outcome won't be changed. If the process is deficient, the Ombudsman will say, go back, do the process again, do it properly this time.
So I was just thinking about when you were both talking about the relevant factors and things you take into account, and it feels like we've got kind of a simple, you can look at this quite simply in many ways, but in the discussions that I've seen, things like pre-97 where they get nil increases, I think that was kind of when I was talking about the industry discussion, that I've seen that coming through now as a discussion point of like, well, these members aren't getting anything. Should the trustees be looking to try to secure something? So the use of discretions in the past and nervousness from trustees that if the surplus is just paid away and the scheme's bought out, those discretionary increases that may have been done in the past have gone. And then cases of financial hardship and whether trustees have a duty to think about those members and trying to do something for them. I know these are kind of edge cases. Well, actually, the pre-97 probably isn't an edge case, but the other bits are probably edge cases. But how do trustees manage that thought process of waiting that and waiting as you both said quite clearly around the employer set this up, the employers created this plan, these are the trustee rules, and this is it. It's those kind of edge bits. I think is where it gets tricky.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, go on, Becky. You go first.
No, I agree. I agree with everything you've said there, David. That it does become more tricky. I think from a trustee perspective, the key is first of all making sure we've gone through that process that we've just talked through, that we've considered all the relevant factors, and as Steve said, is that we can make sure that our position is defendable, whatever that position might be. I don't think that even if we came to the conclusion that we say, actually, we think the company is overfunded, that doesn't prevent us as trustees from asking the question and going back to the company and saying, well, actually, you know what, we've got a scheme here where there's no pre-97 increases. We've had really high inflation over years, and so we want you to at least consider it. And so I definitely think as trustees that is something, I'm not saying we have to ask it, but we can certainly ask a question to the sponsor and put behind it our rationale as to why we think some of that surplus should go back to the members.
Absolutely.
Steve,
It's a good.
yeah.
No, absolutely. I mean, Rebecca, you're absolutely right, and it is important. Trustees must raise these points because the employer may be completely oblivious to the fact that this is actually a deficiency, perceived deficiency in the plan, and at the end of the day, very likely, the people who are now running the company, I mean, they're human beings. They're not a robot. Well, at least not at the moment, anyway. But they're human beings as well. But they're likely not the human beings that were around when the plan was first set up. They are living in the current world, and there is also probably quite an important aspect as far as the employer is concerned in terms of its reputation. Clearly there is money there from which these entitlements, or these benefits could be provided, and it is a decision of both employer and trustee, depending on what the rules say. If it's solely a trustee discretion, then the trustee should consult the employer, but is absolutely not required to seek agreement. If it's an employer decision, well, that story's been taken away from you. It's back with the trustees again. These are all aspects which need to be aired and fleshed out as part of that decision-making process. And as you say, David, very frequently, very often, they are raised.
Yeah.
I was just going to add another point onto that as well, is that we've talked about specific benefits and going back and possibly asking the sponsors, saying that we want to use some of the surplus to go towards that. I think we also have to think about, as trustees, about treating members fairly as well, and so that should come into any decision making or any ask that we make of a sponsor in relation to the use of that surplus. For example, I'm not saying it's not treating members fairly, but if we're rewarding the pre-97 increase, what does that mean for the rest of the membership where they haven't got as many pre-97 benefits? So those are considerations that trustees need to have as well. I also think that when you are looking at a scheme where it's buying out and winding up, there's a practical consideration, which is what will the insurer actually agree to insure? So will they uplift those benefits? We know that they want it to be as simple as possible, so we do see a lot of the time it might just be a simple percentage uplift to all benefits when you are using some of the surplus. So those are just some of the things that we do need to think about when we're thinking about that surplus, if we are looking to share some of it with the members.
Becky, you're segueing us beautifully into Steve. I don't know if you were going to comment on ways that we can share the surplus with.
Yeah, absolutely.
Members.
I mean, I was going to say, I mean, it's important to draw a distinction here with regard to a scheme ongoing and a scheme in wind up. A scheme ongoing, you're still dealing with future risk. The surplus is, ultimately it's can be quite rightly regarded as a buffer against adverse investment performance, a buffer against adverse employer experience. It is a safety net, and it's a highly valuable one. On a wind-up, of course, you're genuinely talking surplus, because very likely you're going to be buying out the benefits. You've gone through a full ben spec. You're pretty confident with regard to exactly what the members are entitled to, and this is genuinely surplus money because there's no ongoing, accrual or entitlement, and ultimately there's no risk in relation to this particular circumstance. So they are different circumstances. But with regard to considerations to take into account, as I say, I go back to from the employer's viewpoint. I set the plan up. It's part of my remuneration structure. I've paid the vast majority of the contributions in, and you can see over time where the employer has gone, well, that's my pension plan. That's what they're getting, but you haven't provided any revaluation. Well, I know I haven't provided any revaluation. Well, that's not good enough. Sorry, we're going to impose that. Are you really? I didn't expect that. How much is that going to cost you? Well, a lot. So that's already part of his surplus has gone in comparison to what they intended to set up. Very likely employers will say, okay, fine, pretty reasonable. But you can see where they've had, benefit change imposed upon them, all of which has sort of denuded whatever surplus might have been in the future. One thing in the new legislation, which I would say I'm slightly concerned about, is the fact that they're watering down the benchmark for what is a surplus and what isn't a surplus. And well, we anticipate, we haven't seen it in regulations yet, but it's anticipated it's going to be self-sufficiency. And there'll need to be an actuarial certificate for that basis. And, we need to we need to understand, what sort of time with which it's measured, etc., that sort of thing. But that's something which I think absolutely needs to be borne in mind when a surplus is going to, whether it is truly in the eyes of everybody truly a surplus, or are we talking about something different? And that, I'm sure, will influence discussion and ultimately decision making in future. The lights come on, my brain's working, so there we go.
I think as well, that's where it when we're looking at a scheme on an ongoing basis, the decisions in some respects become more difficult for trustees for that one reason you've talked about as well, in terms of the funding position when you can release surplus, reducing. So there'll be a question for trustees: at what point would you allow it to be released, if at all? Because the legislation gives you that power doesn't mean say you're going to do it. But on an ongoing basis, it's, as we've talked about, it's not a fixed pot. The benefits haven't been secured, so you then having as trustee to think about risk over a period of time. You won't have the same visibility as you would if it just moves to an insurer, so it's remaining in the scheme. You need to think about the covenant, but then it's also the risk that has been taken in relation to those members' benefits. So if you were to release surplus at self-sufficiency, what does that mean? What happens if things don't go according to plan? So you obviously need to make sure the right framework's in place if it is agreed. I think it becomes a lot simpler if a decision's made to run on and then surplus is extracted at the end of it, which is similar really to what happens on a buyout and wind up. But I think there's going to be a lot for trustees to think about.
Absolutely. I mean, sorry, David. One thing, just on that point, actually, it's a great point, and it's something which definitely needs to be discussed. But we're beginning to see it now in terms of this brilliant industry that we work in. The ingenuity and the thought processes in order to address that exact point. How can the employer get the money and yet also provide security for members? And this is where we're beginning to see kind of the reverse of asset-backed funding arrangements. So asset-backed funding arrangements post-banking crisis, no one had any money, but we need to make a contribution to the pension plan. Okay, well, can we contribute a bit of real estate? And structures were created to effectively allow that to happen. This one is, we're seeing that in reverse. So I want the surplus back out, but how do we know that we're going to be protected if you spend it and then you go bust? Well, okay, well, I'll offer you this real estate. It's unencumbered real estate. That's an asset out here. You can take a security over that. I just want the money. So there are, the great thing about our industry is we are creating structures which allow the flexibility, but equally the protection. And that's the wonderful thing. And I really hope, and it looks like it should be okay, I really hope the legislation doesn't, limit that kind of ingenuity and that creativity. But hopefully we will find collectively, an industry will find a way to allow this to happen, but at least try and keep members, still protected. And trustees, look, this is ultimately anti-embarrassment for trustees. You don't want to be in a situation where, the employer's taken the money and run. Gone bust, and the trustees are left holding the scheme when they, and indeed, being examined with 2020 hindsight in terms of decisions which they might have made had they been able to predict the future. An invidious position to be in.
Yeah, I mean, we do hear, even still now, people will debate and speak very badly about contribution holidays in the past, even though there wasn't a major thing, just the fact that existed. Schemes, employers took contribution holidays when funding was over, whatever it was, 110% of MFR, whatever it was back in the day. That still gets bandied around as disgraceful employers abandoning their obligations and playing fast and loose with their pension schemes. And we can fast forward 20 years and who knows, I wouldn't want to be a trustee in an ongoing scheme making that decision to return that surplus. I think I'd be wanting to be very certain that this is in the members' interests and the employers'. Those interests are aligned. We're not just trying to help the employer get some money out. I think it's good luck, Becky.
I mean, it's worth mentioning that the scale point. The legislation has been introduced against this backdrop of this so-called 160 billion in surplus assets. I mean, I keep on seeing PwC reports where the number begins with a 2, and it's a big 2. It's a big number. And yet the impact assessment, I think, that the government itself produced was something fairly anemic, something where between 11 and 20 billion will actually find its way back out of these plans. So, and I suspect a lot of that is going to be down to the fact that this is going to be a tap that's ultimately going to be controlled by the trustees. You will need trustee agreement. That is quite clear. Very likely you're going to need employer agreement as well. So there's going to have to be some kind of a deal done, some kind of agreement where you can reach balance that, yes, this is definitely in the best interest of the members, but also clearly it's also something that the employer is motivated to do as well.
Okay, I'm gonna have to move us on a little bit. Just sorry, there's a couple of things I did want us to touch on, but then time is racing up behind us. So just a quick comment from Steve, I think, first, and then I'll bring you in, Becky. But just around what form, I did try to do this earlier actually, but
sorry, I
both
jumped in. No, yeah, that's right. I jumped in thinking of something else before. So form in terms of form on two counts. What form can the surplus distribution take to the employer? Well, there's no limitation on that. That's just cash. Or, as we saw with HSBC, that there are perhaps a less controversial, less less egregious form of surplus distribution is to use surplus in the DB to fund DC contributions, or indeed augment DC benefits. There are many ways of dealing with it, but ultimately, once it's in the employer's hands, there's no restrictions. Sensible employers will use it for capital expenditure. I suspect others may not, but ultimately, it all washes through the employer. As far as members are concerned, this is probably where invite Rebecca's comments here. But as far as members are concerned, I think all of the issues that we've discussed before can be taken into account. Absolutely inflationary pressure, absolutely pre-97 increases. We see that time and time again with the surplus that exists within the PPF. Those are absolutely standard requests, which are entirely understandable from a set of trustees. That said, you can also see a circumstance where you're dealing with a tiny amount of surplus. And if you convert that into a pension, it's going to be an extra 57p a week. Virtually meaningless as far as the members are concerned. Thankfully, we now have legislation anticipated in April 2027, which is going to allow small lump sums to be distributed to members, which will be meaningful. All of a sudden you get 150 quid before Christmas. That makes a difference. All of a sudden whereas 150 quid spread over a person's life, retirement life, means nothing, absolutely nothing at all. So there's more flexibility. The industry's been crying out for this, but fortunately that is now coming in, thank goodness.
Becky, do you want to come in on
that? Well, yeah, I think we've covered off, all of the different ways in which we could pay surplus to members. I think really it's just working through the practical side of it. What options are actually workable. So we've talked before about with insurers. So if you've got a scheme that's winding up, like what can they do, what will they do? Fairness to members. That doesn't mean to say you have to give all the members exactly the same, but we just do need to make sure we've considered all the groups of members, because ultimately we've talked a few times about when we've got a surplus, we will be going out to members with some form of consultation, or if it's ongoing, telling the members, and we need to make sure that whatever we decide stands up, to scrutiny.
So we've talked a lot about the surplus, and we've talked a little bit, a decent amount around the relevant and irrelevant factors the trustees need to think about. I think the one thing we haven't touched on in that discussion is sort of managing the conflicts of interest that might arise on a board. I think Becky, you would like to talk a little bit about how to manage those conflicts when they arise.
Yeah, so as we've talked about, there's not a single right answer when we're talking about where the surplus goes, but it's really important for us to understand what each party is trying to achieve, because what we do find is once a position becomes entrenched, whether that's company, trustee side, it can be really difficult to reach a balanced outcome. So I think conflict should be at the forefront of everybody's mind right from the outset. And I'm particularly talking, about traditional trustee board. I expect when you've got, you know, professional sole trustee, independent trustee, that it's less of an issue. But I think it's possibly maybe one of the most unappreciated challenges as well. So you'll have, you know, if you've got your traditional board, you can have a company nominated trustee, member nominated trustees, and you know they can have, I'm not saying they have their own views on, you know, what fair looks like, and it doesn't mean so they're not acting in good faith. It's just that they've got different perspectives and they do have different interests. So I think having a professional independent trustee can be really important in that context. We've seen this, you know, in practice many times, and partly it's because we've been that experience, so we can talk through, you know, the similar situations. We've seen how it's played out, be able to bring that perspective into the discussion, which supports, you know, our kind of co-trustees, but importantly it brings in that objectivity. So as a professional trustee, we're not coming to the table with that, you know, inherent alignment to either the employer or a particular group of members. We're thinking about all the things that we've just talked about today, and we can take a step back, but we can also then help each of the trustees to take that step back, hopefully before they become too entrenched, and help them, you know, really focus on those key factors. And I think it's, you know, as a professional trustee, we have that really important role as well in helping to structure that decision-making process and bring everybody back to what those relevant factors are, and support the board in, you know, in reaching a balanced and defendable outcome, which is, you know, it's obviously really critical. But as I said, I think its conflict should be considered, particularly where you've got, you know, these traditional trustee boards. It should be considered day one.
Steve, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I completely agree with everything that Becky's just said. Actually, I mean, you know, the importance of ensuring that there isn't a conflict or even a perceived conflict on the board is the risk of having the decision set aside by virtue of there being a conflict of interest. That's the risk that we're trying to get rid of here. But ultimately, it's one of, you know, arriving at the right conclusion using the right using the right process to arrive at a conclusion that by virtue of the right process is the right conclusion. You know, and I think, I mean, every board of trustees, you know, should go through a conflict, you know, assessment at the beginning of every trustee meeting. And I think when we're talking about surplus distributions, I mean, that is an area of, you know, sensitivity, contention, controversy, which absolutely needs to, you know, you need to completely flush out and remove all potential conflict of interest on your board, just to make it, you know, just to make you completely clean. So remove individuals who might be wearing two hats, or make sure they're very clear with regard to what hat they're wearing and in relation to that discussion, and you have very clear boundaries which are set out. And again, all of that is set out at the beginning of every meeting. And I completely agree with Becca. There is always a comfort that can be drawn if you've got a professional trustee on the board. It kind of gives that sort of, well, there's a professional trustee there. They will have had experience of this. They will be able to, you know, will have pointed out to the board, you need to be aware of conflicts of interest. And there is that, you know, it definitely brings that, as well as the independence that Becca spoke of as well. There's definitely a comfort that can be drawn from that.
Yeah, when I've talked about it with trustees, and when I've worked with lots of mentees, and I think the point you made, Steve, around the perception, because quite often these people are very diligent, very clear of their roles. You know, we've talked about these sorts of things for years. Conflict of interest aren't new. It's just that I almost sort of talk about it more like, if you're going to write to the members and say you're paying the surplus back to the employer, which is a legitimate decision to make, but if there's a sniff that there's somebody on the board who also works for the employer, well, they would vote for that, or somebody, you know, all these sorts of things. And that's not to say there is a conflict. It's not to say that person has acted badly. It's just that perception of it, I think, is sometimes, and I find myself sometimes saying to trustees, I think you should step aside. I'm not saying you're conflicted. I'm not saying you're not acting in good faith. I'm just saying it just might, from an outsider, and as you say, it's controversial, it can be emotive. I think from an outsider, it would just be better if you just weren't involved in that decision, because it makes it easier for us to defend that decision if it's challenged by the members. I think that's really important.
Completely agree. I mean, but on an ongoing under current legislation and indeed on a wind up, you have to notify the members. And you know, with plenty of notice before you actually pay anything. I mean, and on a wind up, you've got to notify them, invite them to make representations, and then once you've made a decision, you've got to notify them again and say that they can make representations to the regulator. I mean, you know, you do not want, having someone who is perceived as wearing two hats is a wrinkle. It might be an explainable wrinkle, an ironable wrinkle, but it's a wrinkle nonetheless, which you should just clear it away. I mean, there's want to see, individuals who've been taken umbrage of that for the very reason that you've just explained, David. You're questioning. You're questioning their integrity, which is, it's a very uncomfortable thing to do, and also quite you can understand why people, who are proud of their integrity and absolutely will make the right decision and have never approached anything other than, with complete integrity to make, in their view, the right decision. That you've got to deal with that in a very diplomatic way, and I think that's where having a professional trustee, if I may say, helps that process, because that can be messaged in a myriad of different ways, in the right way, which then just reduces the temperature a little bit. And you can then get to a situation where, if there's ever 20/20 hindsight by the ombudsman or the regulator, you just feel cleaner in terms of your fact pattern and as I say, the process.
Okay, so time is against us. So this has been a fantastic conversation. But Becky, I just wanted to get your final thoughts, any summing up takeaways from this conversation, and then Steve, I'll come to you after that.
So first, I'd say it's not about finding one single right answer, and it's about how we approach it. What is a really complex decision. So a few things that really matter. The first one, be really clear on objectives, decision-making power. Steve's talked about that quite a bit. Who's involved? What are we trying to achieve? And how decisions are going to be made. Second, this one's really important. There needs to be a robust and really well-structured process. We know that decisions we make, they're going to stand up to scrutiny. And we need to make sure that we've considered the right factors, we've taken advice, documented decisions. Third, spoken about, recognise and actively managing conflicts, a real key one for me. They are inevitable in this space. We're going to have a different mix of perspectives on what fair looks like. Finally, we need to keep a strong focus on the members, make sure our decisions are fair, we can clearly explain it to them, and we don't compromise security of members' benefits with whatever it is we decide.
That's great. Thank you, Becky. So, and Steve, your closing thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, well, Becky's described it brilliantly as far as the entire process is concerned. I mean, ultimately, look, it's a question of making sure you've taken into account all the factors. That includes taking advice. One thing that I've learned over the years is that every circumstance is different. The fact pattern for every circumstance, yes, there's some of it maybe similar to others, but ultimately in those circumstances, for that employer, that board of trustees, that scheme rules, it's always unique, and it's important that all the trustees and the employer all take advice. They go through the right process. And it is openly and properly debated and discussed. And due process is followed. In terms of what's the right answer, I mean, any good lawyer can give you a very long advice note with regard to why it's perfectly justifiable to give the entirety of the surplus back to the employer, and then another will give you an advice note to say it's perfectly reasonable to share that with the members, or indeed for the trustees to make a decision to give it all to the members and the employer as well. So there are every set of circumstances is completely different. One thing which I would just say, and that is the current legislation requires members to be notified. I would be quite surprised if the new legislation didn't include that. But this one aspect, I can assure you, is probably the biggest reason why you should just avoid surpluses if you can. Avoid having them in the first place. And that is the moment you make a notification to a member and you mention surplus, you're in the realm of members making their views very well heard. They have the ombudsman, which is a free legal service, and all of a sudden you're in a world of added expense. And when you're trying to wind up the plan, particularly if you're not talking about a huge surplus, that's a material issue. which can give rise to just having to distribute surplus in order just to satisfy the members in order to get your plan away. So the best thing about surplus is actually never to have a surplus. But there we go. David, back to you.
Well, that's great. Thank you both for joining me today to talk through the use of surplus and who it belongs to. A debate that's going to continue, and as Steve has hinted, there's more legislation, regulation coming down, so this debate is going to dominate the industry for the next few years, I think. But this has been a great contribution to that discussion, so I thank you both on behalf of the listener, and I'll listen. I'll see the listener again on the next episode of The Broadcast.